The cold of the cracked vinyl seat seeped through Ilara's thin jeans, a deep ache that settled into her bones. Outside, the world was a blur of headlights and the low rumble of passing trucks on the interstate, each one a universe moving forward while hers was frozen in this rusty metal box. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she felt her stomach clench with a familiar, gnawing emptiness. She hadn't eaten in a day, saving the last of the crackers for the children. She glanced into the back seat. Leo, only 8, was curled into a tight ball, his face etched with a worry that shouldn't belong to a child. Beside him, 5-year-old Mia breathed softly, her small chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. Ilara's own breath caught in her throat, a sob she refused to release. She opened her worn wallet and counted the bills under the faint glow of a distant street lamp. $87. That was it. The sum total of her life. A cold, hard number that felt like a death sentence. The smell of stale coffee and old upholstery filled her nostrils, the suffocating scent of absolute failure. Her heart didn't just ache, it felt like a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Her mind replayed the phone call, the detached, clinical voice of her supervisor echoing in the silence of the car. Restructuring, he'd said, a single, sterile word to erase her livelihood. She could almost smell the sharp, chemical scent of the industrial bleach she used to scrub the office floors, a smell she once hated, but now associated with the dignity of a paycheck. They had fired her from a job cleaning up other people's messes, and now her own life was an unfixable disaster. The humiliation rose in her throat, hot and acidic, the same way it had when she'd handed in her uniform. She was just Ilara, 32, a former cleaner, disposable. A knot of shame tightened in her gut, so intense it was a physical pain. It wasn't just about the money. It was the crushing feeling of being utterly worthless, a ghost in a world that had no place for her. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the driver's side window, feeling the vibration of a passing semi-trailer rattle through her skull. They took everything, her job, her dignity, her future. Just 3 days ago, there had been a different kind of cold. It was the chilling silence after the landlord's heavy fist hammered on their apartment door. That sound, a brutal, percussive thud, still echoed in her ears. Then came the shame, a burning heat on her cheeks, as she saw Mrs. Gable from 2B peeking through her blinds, her face a mask of pity and judgment. Ilara could still feel the crisp, cruel paper of the eviction notice in her hand, the black ink spelling out their doom. She had carried their life out in 2 cardboard boxes and 3 trash bags, the meager collection of their existence piled on a patch of dying grass by the curb. The most unbearable sound was not the landlord's gruff orders, but the small, heartbroken whimpers coming from Mia, who clutched a worn teddy bear and asked why they had to put her bed outside. A sharp, searing pain had lanced through Ilara's chest, making it hard to breathe. That wasn't just an apartment. It was the only home her children had ever known, and she had failed to protect it. It was gone. Now, the only home they had was this cramped, cold tomb on wheels. A profound, animalistic wave of protective fury surged through Ilara, immediately drowned by a tide of utter despair. She looked at her children again, her heart constricting with a love so fierce it was painful. Leo, always trying to be the brave little man, had a deep frown etched between his brows even in sleep. He hadn't complained once, but she saw the fear in his eyes. And Mia, so small and vulnerable, had her thumb tucked in her mouth, her soft breaths fogging a small circle on the chilled window pane. Their quiet, sleeping forms were an accusation. Their hunger was her failure. Their cold was her inadequacy. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry now burned behind her eyes, silent and hot. She pulled her own thin coat off and gently draped it over them, tucking it around Mia's small shoulders. The metal of the door handle was ice cold against her fingers. A shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature racked her body. She had to do something, anything, before this cold stole them too. Her gaze fell upon the crumpled, dirt-smudged envelope on the passenger seat, a letter from a lawyer she'd never heard of, regarding a great-uncle she'd never met. It was an inheritance, but the word "what," which should have sounded like salvation, was a mockery. The property was infamous in her family, a running joke at holiday gatherings years ago. The Dust Bowl, they called it. A patch of barren, sun-scorched earth in a desolate region. famous only for being completely and utterly worthless. The thought of going there wasn't an act of hope. It was an act of final surrender. It was the only alternative to waking up to a police officer's tap on the window, the only place left to run where they might be left alone. A cold dread, heavy and thick as mud, settled in her stomach. This wasn't a new beginning. It was the end of the line. With a trembling hand, Ilara turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life with a protesting groan, its sound filling the suffocating silence. She put the car in drive, pulling away from the curb and into the darkness, heading toward a place that promised nothing at all. The drive was a punishing ordeal, a slow crawl into the heart of nowhere. Ilara's rusty car, already on its last legs, protested every mile with a cacophony of squeals and groans. The highway asphalt eventually gave way to a cracked and pitted county road, which in turn dissolved into a dusty track that seemed to stretch into an infinite, shimmering heat haze. The air conditioning had died years ago, so the windows were rolled down, but instead of relief, they only invited a relentless blast of hot, gritty wind that coated everything in a fine layer of reddish dust. The smell was of hot metal, burning oil, and the dry, ancient scent of the parched earth itself. Ilara felt her skin grow tight and her throat raw. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her body tense. Every rattle from the engine sent a jolt of pure terror through her. If the car died out here, they would be utterly stranded, a forgotten footnote in this vast, empty landscape. She felt her hope, a tiny, flickering candle flame being battered by the harsh wind. Their meager supply of water, stored in flimsy plastic bottles, was already warm and tasted of plastic. Ilara rationed it with the care of a desert nomad, giving most of it to Leo and Mia, whose faces were flushed red from the oppressive heat. Mia had begun to whimper in the back seat, her complaints a constant, low drone of "I'm hot, mommy," and "I'm thirsty." Leo, trying to be the man of the family, just stared out the window, his jaw set. But Ilara could see the faint tremor in his hands. Her stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot, not just from her own hunger, but from the guilt of her children's suffering. She had only $40 left after buying gas at the last rundown station they'd passed, a solitary outpost that seemed to mark the edge of civilization. $40 and a quarter tank of fuel. It had to be enough. It just had to be. A cold sweat trickled down her spine despite the blistering heat. She felt like an astronaut drifting away from her ship, the lifeline of her resources growing thinner with every second. This wasn't a journey toward a bright new future. It was a retreat from total annihilation. Ilara kept repeating this to herself, trying to manage her own expectations, to crush any foolish spark of optimism before it could grow and burn her later. The land, the Dust Bowl, was a family punchline, a symbol of failed ambition. She didn't expect a charming farmhouse or rolling green hills. Her hope was far more humble, more primal. She prayed for a roof, even a broken one that didn't have wheels. She prayed for four walls, even if they were crumbling. That could offer a sliver of privacy and a shield from judging eyes. She just wanted a place to exist, a piece of ground where she could stop running and catch her breath, where her children could sleep without the fear of a police officer's knock on the window. She felt her heart thumping a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. The hope she held onto was not for prosperity, but for mere survival, a flimsy shield against the abyss that was yawning just behind them. The landscape grew increasingly hostile. The last vestiges of green had vanished hours ago, replaced by a monotonous panorama of cracked ochre-colored clay and skeletal-looking shrubs that clung stubbornly to life. There were no other cars, no signs of life, no power lines humming alongside the road. The silence was immense, broken only by the groaning of her car and the whistle of the wind. It felt like they had driven off the edge of the map into a forgotten world. The isolation was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the air and pressed in on the small car. A shiver of primal fear, the kind her ancestors must have felt facing the vast, unforgiving wilderness, traced its way down her spine. This wasn't just rural, it was a void. She felt a profound sense of being utterly alone, a tiny, insignificant speck in a landscape that was actively indifferent to her survival. The loneliness was so profound it was nauseating, a dizzying vertigo that made the horizon seem to tilt and sway before her weary eyes. Following the crumpled map from the lawyer, Ilara made a final turn onto a path that was barely distinguishable from the surrounding wasteland. The tires crunched over loose gravel and dry, brittle twigs. The car bucked and shuddered, and for a terrifying moment, she thought the axle would snap. Then she saw it. Nailed to a rotted, leaning fence post was a wooden sign, its letters faded by decades of relentless sun. A few were missing, but the words were still legible, a cruel confirmation of their destination. The Dust Beewell. It wasn't just a family nickname. It was the property's official damning title. A wave of cold dread washed over her, so intense it made her gasp for air. The sight of that sign was like a punch to the gut. It was real. This wasteland, this pit of despair, was now hers. Her stomach churned, and she had to fight back a surge of bitter, acidic bile. This wasn't a home. It was a joke. A cruel, cosmic joke played on a woman who had nothing left to lose but the last shred of her sanity. As the car crested a small, dusty rise, the full extent of the ruin came into view. The word farmhouse was a wild exaggeration. What stood before them was a skeleton, a collapsed skeletal structure that looked as if a giant had taken a bite out of its roof and spat the pieces out. One entire section of the roof had caved in, leaving a gaping wound open to the sky. The windows were not just shattered. They were empty sockets, dark and vacant, like the eyes of a skull. The porch sagged at a drunken angle, its floorboards splintered and missing. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood beneath a ghostly silver grey, weathered and warped. Ilara's hands went limp on the steering wheel, and the car rolled to a slow, final stop. The engine sputtered and died with a final shuddering cough. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. The fragile, desperate hope she had nurtured for hundreds of miles didn't just fade, it shattered. It exploded into a million sharp, glittering shards of pure despair. Ilara sat frozen for a long moment, the silence ringing in her ears. Then slowly, as if moving through deep water, she pushed the car door open. The groan of the rusty hinges was the only sound. The heat hit her first. A physical blow, a solid wall of scorching air that stole her breath. Then came the smell. It was a complex, nauseating perfume of decay. The dominant scent was dry rot and ancient, sun-baked dust. But underneath it lay the damp, musty odor of mold and mildew, a hint of something sour like animal droppings, and the faint, unsettling sweetness of decomposition. She took a step, and the ground crunched under her worn shoe. It wasn't soil. It was a hard-baked crust of clay, fractured into a mosaic of deep, thirsty cracks. A lone, desiccated tumbleweed scraped past her feet, propelled by a hot gust of wind. The place was not just abandoned. It felt malevolent, as if the land itself had died, and was now actively rotting under the relentless sun. Her stomach heaved violently. "Are we here, Mommy?" Leo's voice was small, stripped of his earlier, forced bravery. Ilara turned to see her children peering out of the car, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Mia's lower lip began to tremble. "It's broken," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The simple, childish observation was a dagger in Ilara's heart. It was broken. They were broken. Everything was broken. She could feel their fear, a palpable thing that radiated from the back seat and mixed with her own, creating a toxic, suffocating cloud. She wanted to lie, to say something reassuring, to spin a tale of adventure and rebuilding. But the words wouldn't come. The lie was too big, the reality too stark and brutal. The despair was a physical weight on her chest, crushing her lungs and making it impossible to form a single hopeful syllable. A profound, soul-deep weariness settled over her, so heavy she felt her knees might buckle. This was it. This was the bottom. She had led her children to a tomb. Her gaze swept across the property, a desperate search for any sign of life, any sliver of potential. There was none. The cracked, sun-baked clay stretched in every direction, punctuated only by withered, thorny bushes and the occasional sun-bleached rock. There wasn't a single green shoot, not a blade of grass. The garden plot her great-uncle had supposedly tended was now just a rectangle of lighter-colored dust, as barren as the rest. A dry, rattling sound caught her attention, and she saw a small lizard scuttling for the shade of a rock. That was it. That was the extent of the wildlife. She walked a few paces away from the car, the dust rising in little puffs around her ankles. She bent down and picked up a handful of the soil. It wasn't soil at all. It was fine, gritty powder, like red sand, that ran through her fingers, leaving no moisture, no life, only a fine, gritty residue. The silence pressed in, a vast, empty silence that mocked her with its indifference. This land couldn't sustain life. It could only bury it. The initial feeling of isolation on the drive now transformed into a sharp, piercing terror. Standing in the oppressive silence, with the ruined house behind her and the dead land stretching to the horizon, Ilara felt a vulnerability she had never known. They were miles from anywhere. No one knew they were here. Her phone had lost its signal hours ago. If one of the children got sick, if she got hurt, if a snake bit them, there would be no help. The thought sent a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline through her veins. In the city, even while homeless in her car, there was a safety net of proximity. There were other people, lights, the distant sound of sirens. There was a world just outside the window. Here there was nothing, just the vast, empty sky and a sun that felt like it wanted to burn them off the face of the earth. A sob, thick and ragged, finally broke from her throat. It was a raw, animal sound of pure, undiluted fear. The car was a cage, but this was a grave, and she had driven her children right into it. With a deep, shuddering breath, forcing her legs to move, Ilara approached the sagging porch. One of the steps had rotted through completely, and she had to carefully step over the hole. The front door hung ajar on a single, groaning hinge. Pushing it open, she was met with a wave of air so thick with the smell of mold and damp rot that it was almost liquid. It coated the back of her throat and made her eyes water. The inside was even worse than the outside had suggested. Sunlight streamed through the giant hole in the roof, illuminating a chaotic mess of fallen beams, sodden plaster, and debris. Puddles of stagnant black water stood on the warped floorboards from some long-ago rain, breeding grounds for mosquitoes and foul odors. The furniture that remained was a collection of ghosts, a collapsed sofa spilling its moldy stuffing, an overturned table with one leg snapped off, and chairs that had rotted into skeletal frames. A cold knot formed in Ilara's stomach. This wasn't a shelter, it was a hazard. As her eyes adjusted to the dim, dusty light, she became aware of sounds, a constant, faint scratching and scuttling from within the walls and under the floorboards. Rats, or something worse. Her skin crawled, and a wave of nausea rose in her throat. In one corner, a dark stain spread across the wall, slick with moisture, and she could see the fuzzy black bloom of mold growing in thick patches. The air was heavy, unbreathable, filled with spores that she knew were toxic. She imagined her children sleeping in this place, breathing in this poison. The thought was so horrifying it made her physically recoil. This place wasn't just unlivable, it was actively dangerous. It was a disease-ridden death trap. She backed away toward the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. The faint hope for a mere roof over their heads now seemed like a foolish, dangerous delusion. A broken roof was one thing, but a place that could actively harm her children was another entirely. She simply could not let them in there. Her desperate eyes searched for any sign of basic amenities, any small mercy. She found the kitchen, if one could call it that. The sink was a rust-stained basin filled with brown, dried leaves and what looked like small animal bones. She turned the single, corroded tap. Nothing. Not even a cough or a sputter from the pipes. The silence was her answer. No running water. Her gaze then went to the walls, searching for light switches or outlets. There were none. Thick cobwebs covered the spots where light fixtures might have once hung from the ceiling. No electricity. The two final nails were hammered into the coffin of her hope. No water to drink or wash with. No power for light or heat or cooking. They had no way to survive here for more than a day. The few bottles of warm water in the car were all they had. The reality was stark and brutal. They were more destitute here, in their own inherited property, than they had been sleeping in their car on a city street. At least they were a short walk from a public fountain or a gas station. A hysterical laugh, sharp and brittle, threatened to bubble up from Ilara's chest. She had driven them all this way, spent their last reserves of money and energy, all for this. This was her great act of maternal protection. She had traded a cramped but sealed metal box for a rotting, toxic, parasite-infested shell with no water. In the car, they were cold and hungry. but they were relatively safe from the elements. They were clean. Here, the dirt, the disease, the decay were all-encompassing and actively hostile. Her vision blurred with unshed tears of rage and self-loathing. The shame she had felt being evicted was nothing compared to this. This was a new, deeper level of failure, a failure of primal instinct. She had led her young to a place where they could not survive. The weight of her mistake was crushing, a physical pressure that made her shoulders slump and her head bow. The car, which had felt like a prison just hours ago, now seemed like a lost sanctuary. She had made everything so much worse. Ilara stumbled back out of the house, away from the suffocating smell, and collapsed onto the cracked, dusty earth. The heat of the ground seeped through her jeans, but she didn't feel it. A profound numbness had taken over, a cold, heavy blanket of absolute despair. She wrapped her arms around her knees, pulling herself into a tight ball, and finally, the sobs she had been fighting for days broke free. They were not quiet, dignified tears. They were gut-wrenching, ragged howls of grief and hopelessness. Torn from the deepest part of her soul, she cried for her lost job, her lost home, her lost dignity. She cried for her children, for the terror in their eyes and the hunger in their bellies. But most of all, she cried for her own monumental stupidity, for clinging to a sliver of hope that had led them to this desolate end of the world. The sun beat down on her back, but all she felt was a bone-deep cold. There was no way forward. There was no way back. They were trapped. Here in the heart of nothing, she had finally hit the bottom. The first night was a frozen hell. Ilara didn't sleep. She sat in the driver's seat, listening to the desolate howl of the wind as it scraped across the dead land, a sound that seemed to claw at the car's thin metal shell. The cold was a physical entity, seeping through every crack and seal, making the vinyl of the seats feel like slabs of ice. She watched her children in the rearview mirror, their small bodies huddled together for warmth under her own thin coat, their breath fogging the glass in little clouds. A profound, soul-crushing despair had settled in her chest, a weight so heavy she could barely draw a breath. She felt like a captain on a sinking ship, having steered her precious cargo directly into an iceberg of her own making. Every gust of wind was a whisper of her failure, every shiver that racked her body a testament to her powerlessness. The silence between the gusts was worse, a vast, crushing emptiness that mirrored the void in her future. This wasn't just hitting bottom, it was being buried alive in it. Sometime in the deep, starless hours before dawn, a new sound began. Not the threatening growl of an animal or the rumble of a distant truck, but a soft, rhythmic tapping on the roof of the car. Pitter-patter, pitter-patter. Ilara's eyes snapped open. Rain. A wave of disbelief washed over her. In this sun-scorched wasteland, rain felt like a miracle, a celestial impossibility. She cracked the window, and the scent that drifted in was intoxicating, the most beautiful smell she had ever known. The clean, earthy fragrance of water meeting parched dust. The air, once thick with choking heat, was suddenly cool and alive. For the first time in days, she took a deep, full breath that didn't feel like inhaling fire. It was a small thing, a brief shower in the middle of nowhere, but it felt like a baptism, a momentary washing away of the grime and the suffocating despair. A single cool droplet landed on her hand, and she didn't wipe it away. It felt like a tear from the sky itself, a sign that the world hadn't entirely forgotten them. When the sun rose, the world was transformed. The oppressive, shimmering heat was gone, replaced by a soft, cool clarity. The rain had stopped, but its presence lingered, a damp freshness in the air that was utterly alien to this place. The reddish clay, once pale and dusty, was now a deep, rich umber, and the air was thick with the potent, life-affirming smell of petrichor. The whole landscape seemed to be breathing a collective sigh of relief. Ilara watched as the first rays of sunlight broke through a curtain of retreating clouds, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. The sheer beauty of it was a sharp, poignant ache in her chest. It was a morning full of promise, a stark and cruel contrast to the utter hopelessness of her situation. It felt like the world was putting on a beautiful show for an audience of one, a condemned woman who could see the beauty but couldn't touch it. Still, the breaking of the monotonous heat was a crack in the armor of her despair. For a fleeting moment, she felt a pinprick of something other than dread. Ilara was rationing out the last of the crackers when Leo, restless after a night cramped in the car, burst out of the door with a whoop of joy. He ran barefoot across the damp earth, his small feet leaving dark prints in the clay. Ilara's first instinct was to call him back, to warn him of snakes or sharp rocks, but she let him go. He needed to burn off the fear and confinement. She watched him run towards the barren rectangle of land they called the garden, a small, resilient figure against the vast emptiness. A moment later, his voice, high and breathless with excitement, sliced through the morning quiet. "Mommy, Mommy, come quick!" Ilara's heart seized, her mind instantly flashing to 100 terrible possibilities. A snake bite, a fall. "Leo, what is it?" she yelled, scrambling out of the car. His answer was not one of pain, but of pure, unadulterated wonder. "The garden. It's blooming. It's blooming with rainbows." His voice was a song of joyous disbelief, a sound she hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. Rainbows. The word hung in the cool morning air, nonsensical and absurd. Ilara's first reaction was a weary exasperation, a child's fantasy. There were no flowers here, nothing to bloom, and the only rainbows she expected to see were the oil slicks in the puddles around their dying car. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, and the thought of chasing a figment of her son's imagination felt like a monumental effort. "Leo, honey, there's nothing there," she started to say, her voice flat and tired. But his insistence was magnetic. "No, really, you have to see." The sheer, unfiltered joy in his voice was a force of nature, a small, bright light pushing against her overwhelming darkness. A flicker of curiosity, long dormant, stirred within her. What could he possibly be seeing? With a heavy sigh that turned into a groan, she forced her stiff limbs to move, shuffling across the damp ground towards her son, fully expecting to find nothing but wet dirt and a disappointed child. It was the last thing she wanted to deal with. As she approached the edge of the barren garden plot, she shielded her eyes against the low-hanging morning sun. Leo was standing in the middle of it, pointing frantically at the ground around his feet. "See? They're everywhere!" Ilara squinted, her eyes struggling to adjust, and then she saw it. At first, it was just a tiny flicker of brilliant turquoise light catching the corner of her eye. She blinked, thinking it was a trick of the sun on a wet leaf, but there were no leaves. Then she saw another glint, this one a flash of deep, fiery red, and another, a spark of emerald green. Her tired brain struggled to categorize the information. The entire surface of the dark, damp soil was alive with 1,000 points of shimmering, multicolored light. It wasn't a reflection. It was something in the ground, unearthed by the rain and now set ablaze by the morning sun. A gasp escaped her lips, a small, involuntary sound of shock. It was beautiful, and it was impossible. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic, uncertain rhythm. Moving as if in a dream, Ilara walked into the center of the plot and knelt, her jeans immediately soaking up the cool dampness of the earth. The closer she got, the more miraculous the sight became. The ground wasn't just sparkling. It was littered with tiny crystalline fragments that were catching the sunlight and fracturing it into a kaleidoscope of brilliant hues. It looked as if someone had shattered a rainbow and scattered the pieces across the mud. Leo was crouched nearby, picking them up and watching them glitter on his palm. "See, Mommy, I told you." His voice was full of the smug satisfaction of a child proven right. Ilara didn't answer. She was utterly transfixed. A cold, prickling sensation ran up her arms. This wasn't natural. It defied every logical explanation she could summon. A wave of awe, so potent it bordered on fear, washed over her. It was like standing on holy ground, witnessing something that should not exist in her broken, miserable world. She felt a profound sense of wrongness, of a secret accidentally revealed. With a hand that trembled slightly, Ilara reached out and touched one of the larger sparkling points. It was hard and cool against her fingertip. Using her nail, she carefully pried it from the thick, wet clay. It came loose with a soft squelch. She held it in the center of her palm, wiping away the mud. It was a small, strangely shaped stone, no bigger than Mia's thumbnail, with a rough, unpolished surface. But as she tilted her hand, it caught a ray of sun and exploded with an internal fire, casting a tiny, perfect prism of brilliant color onto her skin. It was impossibly beautiful, a tiny shard of pure light. She picked up another, this one a pale yellow, and another that was a deep, translucent blue. They weren't just colored glass or quartz. They had a depth, a fire, a density that felt significant. A cold knot of disbelief formed in her stomach. She had no idea what they were, but she knew, with an instinct that defied logic, that they were not worthless pebbles. They felt like tiny, sleeping embers of immense value. Her mind, which had been sluggish with grief and hunger, was now racing, trying to connect the dots. These weren't flowers. They weren't glass. The brief, intense rainstorm had washed away the top layer of fine dust, exposing these gems. They had been here all along, hiding just beneath the surface of the worthless land. A strange, giddy feeling, dangerously close to hope, began to bubble in her chest, and she ruthlessly suppressed it. It was too soon. It was probably fool's gold, or some strange local mineral anomaly. But the sheer quantity of them was staggering. The entire garden plot was shimmering. Why here? Why were they concentrated in this one specific area? A question. The first real question she had asked herself in days that wasn't about immediate survival bloomed in her mind. A profound shift occurred within her. The land was no longer just a dead, hostile entity. It was now a puzzle. It had a secret. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Elara felt a powerful, compelling urge to uncover it. The despair was still there, but it was now overlaid with a thin, fragile layer of intense curiosity. "Mommy, look, there's a river of them." Leo's excited shout pulled Elara from her trance. He was standing near the edge of the garden plot, pointing a muddy finger towards the crumbling foundation of the farmhouse. Elara stood up, her knees cracking in protest, and followed his gaze. He was right. The sparkling stones weren't just randomly scattered. While they peppered the entire garden, there was a distinct line, a denser concentration of them, that formed a glittering serpentine path across the dark earth. It was as if a small stream had flowed from somewhere near the house, through the garden, and deposited the heaviest, most brilliant stones along its course. Her heart gave a powerful thud. It was a trail of breadcrumbs left by the rain. A cold thrill, a mix of fear and excitement, prickled her skin. This wasn't an accident. This was a clue. The land wasn't just holding a secret. It was actively trying to show it to her. She felt like a character in a book, standing at the beginning of a mysterious chapter she was compelled to read. A sudden, manic energy surged through Elara, a potent cocktail of adrenaline and desperate hope that burned away her exhaustion. It was a wild gamble, a fool's errand, but it was infinitely better than sitting in the car waiting for despair to consume them. "Stay right behind me," she told the children, her voice sharp with an intensity that made them both fall silent and nod. She began to walk, her eyes fixed on the glittering path, her footsteps slow and deliberate, as if she were tracking a wounded animal. The faint trail of light on the dark, wet clay led her away from the garden plot, past a skeletal, long-dead tree, and straight towards the ruined farmhouse. With every step, the feeling of being on the verge of a monumental discovery grew stronger, a buzzing in her veins and a roaring in her ears. The world narrowed to this single, sparkling line. The hunger in her belly, the cold dread in her heart, it all faded into the background, replaced by this singular driving purpose: find where the river of rainbows began. The glittering trail ended abruptly at the side of the house, near the most dilapidated section of the foundation. Here, the concentration of stones was the thickest, a dense carpet of shimmering light on the mud, and in the center of it all was something she hadn't noticed before, camouflaged by decades of dirt and neglect. It was a large, square platform of weathered wooden planks, laid flush with the ground. They were gray and splintered, with rusted nail heads pinning them to a half-buried frame. It looked like the cover to something. A cellar, a cistern. Her mind immediately flashed to the name of the place, the Dust Bowl, an arid, barren farm, and then she saw it, a corroded iron hand pump lying on its side in the weeds nearby, disconnected from whatever lay beneath the wood. It was a well, an old dry well, and the rain had just washed a fortune in glittering stones out from around its sealed edges. A jolt of understanding, so powerful it was like a physical blow, struck her. Whatever was down there, someone had wanted it to stay hidden. The need to see inside was a physical craving, a burning itch under her skin. This was it. This was the heart of the mystery. She ran to the trunk of her car, her movements frantic and clumsy, and rummaged through the sparse collection of tools she kept for emergencies. Her fingers closed around the cold, heavy steel of a tire iron. It felt like a weapon, like a key. Back at the well, she wedged the flattened tip of the iron into the crack between two of the thickest planks. She threw her entire body weight onto the end of the tool. For a moment, nothing happened. The wood groaned in protest. She repositioned her feet, gritting her teeth, and pushed again, a raw, guttural cry of effort tearing from her throat. There was a loud, sickening crack of splintering wood, followed by the screech of a rusty nail being torn from its hold. The plank lifted a few inches. A surge of triumphant adrenaline shot through her veins. It was working. One by one, she attacked the planks, her movements fueled by a desperate, frenzied strength she didn't know she possessed. With the final plank pried loose and thrown aside, a gaping black square was revealed. A wave of air rushed up from the opening, and Elara instinctively recoiled. It was not the foul, swampy miasma of stagnant water she had expected. Instead, it was a shockingly cold, dry air that smelled of deep stone, minerals, and something else. The clean, sterile scent of absolute nothingness. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed away from the world for a very, very long time. She knelt at the edge, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs, and peered down into the void. It was an absolute, impenetrable blackness. The morning sunlight seemed to be swallowed by the opening, unable to penetrate its depths. She called out, "Hello?" and her voice fell into the hole, not echoing back but simply vanishing, absorbed by the immense, silent darkness. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold air rising from the depths, traced a path of ice down her spine. It was the terrifying, thrilling shiver of standing at the precipice of the unknown. Her mind raced. She needed a light. The memory of a cheap, battery-powered emergency lantern she kept tucked under the passenger seat surfaced. She sprinted to the car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely unlatch the glove box. She also grabbed a length of frayed nylon rope that had been used to tie down the trunk lid. Back at the well, her fingers felt clumsy and thick as she tied the rope securely around the lantern's plastic handle, triple-checking the knot. This felt like the single most important moment of her life. She switched the lantern on. Its beam was weak, a pale yellow circle of light, but it was enough. Taking a deep breath to steady her hammering heart, she slowly, carefully, began to lower the lantern into the yawning black maw. The beam cut a shaky cone through the darkness, illuminating the rough, circular walls of the well shaft, constructed from large and uneven stones, covered in a fine layer of ancient dust. The air grew colder as the light descended. The world seemed to hold its breath. Down and down the lantern went, its fragile beam a lonely star plunging into an earthen galaxy. 5 feet, 10 feet. The stone walls were slick with something that wasn't moisture, a dark mineral stain that seemed to weep from the rocks. 15 feet. The rope continued to play out through her hands. 20. Suddenly, the light snagged on something. Elara stopped lowering the rope, her breath caught in her throat. The lantern's beam, now swinging gently side to side, illuminated a feature she couldn't have seen from above. A narrow ledge, a natural outcropping of stone, jutted out from the wall of the well shaft about 20 feet below the surface, and resting on that ledge, caked in dust but clearly man-made, was a bulky object. It was pale and rectangular, a lump in shape that didn't belong in the geological symmetry of the well. It looked like a bag, a large canvas bag. Her heart stopped. It was wedged there, waiting. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. It was real, it was all real. Someone had hidden something down there. The bag was there, tantalizingly close yet utterly unreachable. The well was too deep to climb, its walls too smooth. A wave of frantic frustration washed over her. To be so close to an answer, only to be thwarted by 20 feet of empty air, was a unique form of torture. Her mind, now honed to a fine point by the mystery, began to race, scanning her surroundings for a solution. Rope. She had rope. She needed a hook. Her eyes darted around the debris-strewn yard. Her gaze landed on a piece of rusted metal sticking out of the dirt near the collapsed porch foundation. A long, thick piece of rebar bent into an L shape from the house's destruction. It was perfect. Using a heavy rock as a hammer and the edge of the well opening as an anvil, she pounded on the metal, the clang echoing across the silent farm. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she painstakingly bent the end of the rebar into a crude but functional hook. With trembling hands, she tied it securely to the end of her precious rope, her knots tight and desperate. Kneeling at the edge of the dark opening, Elara felt like a fisherman on the shore of a mythical sea. She lowered her makeshift grappling hook into the well, the rope sliding through her dusty palms. It was a clumsy, awkward process. She couldn't see what she was doing, relying only on the feel of the rope and the faint scraping sounds that echoed up from the depths. The hook clanged and scraped against the stone walls, the noises startlingly loud in the quiet morning. Mia and Leo watched from a safe distance, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. They had never seen their mother like this, so fiercely focused, so driven by a wild, primal energy. Elara's first few attempts were failures. The hook glanced off the bag or missed it entirely. A groan of frustration escaped her lips. "Come on," she whispered, her voice a raw, desperate prayer to the darkness. "Please." She pulled the rope up, took a deep breath and lowered it again, concentrating with every fiber of her being. On the fifth try, she felt it. Not the hard scrape of metal on stone, but a soft, yielding snag. The rope went taut. The hook had caught. A jolt of pure, unadulterated triumph shot through her. "I've got it!" she yelled, though there was no one to hear but her children. She braced her feet against the edge of the well and began to pull. The weight was immediate and surprising. It was heavy, so much heavier than a simple canvas sack should be. The nylon rope, thin and frayed, dug painfully into the flesh of her hands, and she gritted her teeth against the burn. She pulled, hand over hand, her back and shoulder muscles screaming in protest. The object resisted, scraping against the stone ledge before finally coming free. Now it was a dead weight, swinging slightly at the end of the rope. Slowly, laboriously, she hauled her prize up from the darkness, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The anticipation was so intense, it was a physical pain in her chest, a crushing pressure of hope and fear combined. With one final, desperate heave, the object cleared the edge of the well and landed on the damp earth with a heavy, solid thud that sent up a puff of red dust. It was a mail sack, made of thick, sturdy canvas, its original color obscured by a thick coating of pale, ancient dust and cobwebs. It was cinched at the top with a length of stiff, rotting rope. Elara fell back, landing hard on the ground, her chest heaving as she sucked in greedy gulps of air. Her hands were raw and red, her muscles trembling violently from the exertion. She just stared at the bag for a long moment, this strange, heavy ghost she had pulled from the earth's gullet. It was real. It was here. Leo and Mia crept closer, their curiosity overriding their fear. "Guys, what is it, Mommy?" Leo asked, his voice a hushed whisper. Elara couldn't answer. She didn't have the breath. She could only stare at the sack, her mind reeling. The answer to everything, the reason for the worthless land and the glittering stones, was lying right there at her feet, waiting. Her hands shaking with a combination of exhaustion and unbearable anticipation, Elara crawled over to the bag. She tugged at the thick, stiff knot at the top. The old rope was brittle and resisted her efforts. With a frustrated cry, she grabbed the tire iron and sawed at the knot with its sharp edge until the fibers gave way. She pulled the mouth of the sack open and peered inside, and the world tilted on its axis. For a moment, her brain refused to process the information her eyes were sending. It was full of rocks, grayish, yellowish, crystalline rocks of all different shapes and sizes. They were dull and dusty. But then, she reached in and her fingers closed around one of the larger stones. As she lifted it into the morning sun, the dust fell away, and an impossible, fiery brilliance ignited within it. It wasn't a rock. It was a massive, uncut, raw diamond, as large as a child's fist. A wave of vertigo washed over her. She plunged both hands into the sack. It was full of them, hundreds of them, a fortune beyond her wildest, most feverish dreams. She fell back onto the dirt, a strangled laugh escaping her lips. It was the sound of a mind breaking under the strain of an impossible reality. Diamonds, a sack full of raw diamonds on a worthless farm in the middle of nowhere. It had to be a dream, a cruel, elaborate hallucination brought on by heat stroke and starvation. She picked up another stone, its weight solid and undeniable in her palm, its sharp edges cool against her skin. It was real. This was real. Her trembling fingers, still disbelieving, dug back into the sack, burrowing past the hard, angular stones. They brushed against something else, something flat and rectangular with sharp corners, something that wasn't a rock. With a jolt of renewed curiosity, she pulled it out. It was a metal box about the size of a shoebox made of tin. It was dark with age and showed a few speckles of rust, but the seams looked tight and secure. It felt heavy, solid. A new wave of adrenaline hit her. The diamonds were the treasure, but she knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that this box held the story. The tin box was sealed with two simple, rusted clasps. They wouldn't budge under her fingers. Using the flattened tip of the tire iron as a lever, she wedged it under one of the clasps and twisted. It snapped open with a sharp metallic crack. She did the same to the second clasp, and it too gave way. She paused, her hand hovering over the lid, her heart hammering against her ribs. This felt more significant, more dangerous than discovering the diamonds. With a deep, shuddering breath, she lifted the lid. A faint hiss of air escaped as the decades-old seal was broken. Inside, preserved in the dry, still air, were two objects. The first was a thick, leather-bound journal, its dark brown cover worn smooth with time. The second was a tight roll of yellowed papers, tied with a simple piece of string. A tremor started in her hands and spread through her entire body. This was not a random stash of wealth. This was a time capsule, a carefully prepared package of information left by someone who knew the value of what was buried on this land and who knew the danger that came with it. With a reverence she didn't know she possessed, Elara carefully lifted the leather diary from the box. The cover was cool and supple against her skin, a stark contrast to the rough, gritty diamonds. She could feel the faint imprint of a hand that had held it long ago. Her hand, her blood. She opened it to the first page. The paper was thick and creamy, and the ink, though faded from black to a soft brown, was still perfectly clear. The handwriting was a precise, elegant cursive, the script of a thoughtful, educated man. Her eyes scanned the first few lines, and the air left her lungs in a rush. My name is Arthur Vance. If this diary has been found, then I am surely dead, and it is likely that my name has been tarnished by lies. But the truth is in this book, and in the maps that accompany it. The truth of a great crime. Arthur Vance, her great-uncle, the family failure. The eccentric recluse who died broke on a worthless farm. A jolt, like an electric current, shot up her spine. Every story she had ever heard about him was a lie. He wasn't a failure. He was a guardian. Her hands shaking, she set the diary aside and carefully untied the string around the rolled-up papers. She unrolled them on the ground. There were 3 of them, large sheets of old paper that had yellowed and grown brittle at the edges. They were geological survey maps of this very region, detailed and professionally drafted, but they were covered, from edge to edge, in dense, frantic handwriting. Her great-uncle's handwriting. There were complex calculations, depth measurements, and chemical compositions scrawled in the margins. One vast section of the map, encompassing his own property and several of the surrounding farms, was circled with a thick red line. Inside this circle, a single, powerful word was written in bold capital letters and underlined 3 times, Kimberlite. The word was unfamiliar to Elara, but its significance was unmistakable. This, combined with the sack of raw diamonds and the ominous opening of the diary, painted a terrifying picture. This dust bowl wasn't worthless. It was the site of a secret so enormous, so valuable, and so dangerous that her great-uncle had died to protect it. The world, which had just exploded with impossible light and fortune, now contracted to the size of the leather-bound book in Elara's trembling hands. The leather was worn smooth, almost like skin, and it was cool to the touch. A shiver traced its way up her arm. She opened the cover, and the smell of old paper, dry ink, and time itself rose up, a scent of secrets kept for decades. The handwriting on the first page was elegant and precise. The ink faded from black to a deep, thoughtful brown. My name is Arthur Vance, she read aloud, her voice a cracked whisper. If this diary has been found, then I am surely dead. And it is likely that my name has been tarnished by lies. A knot of ice formed in Ilara's stomach. She felt her heart begin to pound, not with excitement, but with a new and terrible kind of dread. This was not a treasure map. It was a confession. It was a warning. The words seemed to lift off the page, charged with the energy of a ghost demanding to be heard. This was the voice of the man the family called a failure. She turned the page, her fingers leaving faint smudges on the brittle paper. They called me a geologist, the next entry began, but I was their Judas goat. The name jumped out at her, stark and brutal. Titan Minerals. Arthur described how the company, under the iron-fisted rule of its founder, the elder Mr. Croft, had hired him with a secret mandate. His mission was not to find value in this arid region, but to methodically and scientifically erase it. They wanted him to create a definitive, official survey proving the land was geologically barren, devoid of minerals, oil, or even significant aquifers. A wave of sick understanding washed over Ilara. The Dust Bowl, the nickname her family had used as a punchline for generations, wasn't an accident of nature. It was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of corporate propaganda, seeded into the local consciousness to devalue the land and break the spirit of the people who lived on it. A cold fury, slow and deep, began to smolder in her gut, a righteous anger on behalf of a man she'd never met. With a growing sense of horror, Ilara skimmed through pages of complex geological data, her eyes catching on phrases that made her blood run cold. Massive kimberlite pipe, Arthur had written, his script growing more frantic and dense. A primary source deposit of staggering scale, directly beneath the Vance property and extending under the adjacent farms. He had found it, the one thing he was hired to bury, a volcanic chimney created by ancient eruptions, choked with raw, uncut diamonds. He estimated the value not in millions, but in trillions. The sack of diamonds she had pulled from the well was not the treasure. It was merely a sample, a handful of sand from a Sahara of wealth. He described the moment of his discovery, not with joy but with paralyzing terror. He knew what Titan Minerals was, what they were capable of. He understood that he had just stumbled upon a secret that would get him, and anyone he told, killed. The diary felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the burden of this deadly knowledge. The plot was diabolical in its simplicity. Arthur laid it all out in short, clipped sentences that vibrated with suppressed rage. With his falsified survey declaring the region worthless, Titan Minerals would leak the information. Land values would plummet. The banks, many of which Croft secretly controlled, would refuse to extend credit to the local farmers. A single bad harvest, a single drought year, and they would all be ruined. Foreclosure, bankruptcy, desperation. Then, Croft and his shell companies would swoop in, playing the part of sympathetic buyers, acquiring thousands of acres of worthless land for pennies on the dollar from families who had worked it for generations. Ilara felt a surge of hot, acidic bile rise in her throat. She thought of the farmers, their calloused hands and sun-beaten faces, forced to sell their birthright for pocket change, their lives destroyed by a lie written on a piece of paper. This wasn't business. It was a massacre, a slow, quiet, corporate genocide. Ilara finally understood the truth of her great-uncle's life. He wasn't a recluse by choice. He was a man in hiding. Horrified by what he was a part of, he had made a choice. He stole the real survey maps, the ones that showed the kimberlite pipe. He took a large sample of the diamonds as undeniable proof. Then he methodically orchestrated his own ruin, becoming the first victim of his own fabricated report. He let the world believe he was a broke, eccentric failure, a man who had lost his mind. It was the perfect cover. Who would look for $1 trillion secret on the property of a man who couldn't even afford to fix his own roof? He had planned to expose the plot, to use the evidence to bring down Titan Minerals and return the wealth to the community. But a sudden illness, a heart attack, had claimed him before he could. He had died a pariah, a family joke, all to protect a secret that now rested in her lap. Tears filled Ilara's eyes, not of pity, but of profound, aching respect. He wasn't a failure. He was a hero. A sound, alien and menacing in the profound quiet, ripped Ilara from the pages of the past. It was not the sigh of the wind or the rustle of a lizard. It was the low, powerful purr of a high-performance engine. Her head snapped up, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs. On the dusty track that served as a driveway, a plume of red dust billowed behind a vehicle that did not belong in this world. It was a long, sleek black sedan, its paint so glossy it looked like a pool of liquid shadow under the harsh sun. The car glided to a smooth stop a few yards from her, its engine settling into a hum of quiet or intimidating power. It was the sound of money and absolute control. The driver's door opened, and Elara felt the air grow colder, the hairs on her arms standing on end. A cold, primal fear, the fear of prey spotting a predator, seized her. She instinctively grabbed the diary and the small tin box, holding them tight to her chest as if their secrets could be absorbed into her very bones. A man emerged from the car, and the sheer incongruity of his presence was jarring. He was tall and slender, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to repel the dust and heat of the wasteland. His shoes were gleaming black leather, and as he stepped onto the parched earth, Elara imagined she could hear the faint sound of them being soiled. His hair was silver, perfectly coiffed, and his face was a handsome, chiseled mask of cool, patrician authority. He surveyed the scene, the ruined house, her rusty car, the two small children huddled together, with an expression of faint, undisguised disdain. A cold, dismissive smile touched the corners of his thin lips. He looked like a wolf who had wandered into a chicken coop and was faintly disappointed by the quality of the livestock. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She felt small, insignificant, and terrifyingly exposed. The sense of power rolling off him was a physical force, pressing down on her, suffocating her. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and confident, his expensive shoes crunching on the dry, gritty soil. The sound was obscene, an intrusion of wealth and power into her world of decay and poverty. Elara's mind screamed at her to run, to grab her children and flee, but her feet felt as if they were bolted to the ground. She felt a fierce, protective instinct rise up, and she subtly shifted her body, placing herself between the approaching man and her children. Leo and Mia stared, their eyes wide and frightened, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The morning, which had been full of impossible discovery, was now thick with a heavy, palpable menace. The sun felt less warm, the air thinner. The man stopped a few feet from her, his shadow falling over her, a cold patch in the blistering heat. She could smell the faint, clean scent of expensive cologne, a smell that was as out of place here as his polished shoes. He was a creature from another reality, a reality where men like him held the power of life and death. "Mrs. Vance, I presume," he began, his voice as smooth and cold as polished river stone. He didn't offer a hand, he didn't need to. His pale blue eyes, the color of a winter sky, flickered from her face, down to the diary she clutched, then to the gaping black hole of the open well shaft. For a fleeting microsecond, a flash of something, annoyance, anger, crossed his features before being instantly suppressed. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "My name is Julian Croft," he said, the name landing in the air like a dropped stone. Croft, the name from the diary, the elder Mr. Croft, this man's father. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over Elara. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the monster from the story, made flesh. The son of the man who had orchestrated this entire monstrous crime. He had been watching, waiting, and now he was here. Her heart felt as if it were trying to beat its way out of her chest. She was face to face with the enemy her great-uncle had died fighting. He smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips that didn't reach his cold eyes. "I'm something of a historian," he lied, the falsehood so blatant, so audacious, it almost made her want to laugh. "I have a passion for acquiring properties with local historical significance. This one has been in our sights for some time." He gestured vaguely at the ruin of the farmhouse. "I understand this property has recently come into your possession. A tragedy, your great-uncle's passing. He was a complicated man." The condescending pity in his voice was a calculated insult, a twisting of the knife. Elara felt a surge of white-hot rage, a protective fury for Arthur's memory. She said nothing. Her silence was her only weapon, her only shield. She squeezed the diary so tightly her knuckles were white, the corner of the book digging into her palm. The physical pain was a welcome anchor in the swirling vortex of fear and anger that threatened to pull her under. Croft let the silence hang for a moment, enjoying her discomfort. He saw her defiance, the anger in her eyes, and it seemed to amuse him. "This place is a ruin," he continued, his voice taking on a practical, dismissive tone. "It's a liability, not an asset. A burden. My organization, a historical preservation society, is prepared to make you a generous offer to take it off your hands. We can have the paperwork drawn up today." He paused, letting the words sink in, his gaze steady and unwavering. $10,000. Cash. The number was an explosion in the quiet air. $10,000. A fortune to her yesterday. An absolute pittance for what she knew was beneath her feet. It was a test, a calculated insult designed to gauge what she knew. The offer was so low it was a confession in itself. He didn't think she was a threat. He thought she was a desperate, ignorant woman who would be grateful for the scraps from his table. The humiliation burned in her cheeks. Ilara's mind was a maelstrom. $10,000 could get them out of here. It could buy a cheap used car that wouldn't die on the highway. It could pay for a deposit on a small apartment. Food for months. It was a lifeline. It was a ticket back to the world. All she had to do was play dumb, sign the paper, and let him have his stolen treasure. She could save her children, guarantee their safety. But the weight of the diary in her hands felt immense. The ghosts of the ruined farmers, the ghost of her heroic great-uncle, all seemed to be watching her, waiting. To accept his offer would be to become complicit in their crime. It would be to spit on Arthur's sacrifice. She couldn't do it. The rage and the grief solidified into something hard and unmovable in her chest. She simply stared at him, her silence her answer. She saw his eyes narrow, the amusement evaporating, replaced by a cold, reptilian stillness. He had his answer. She knew. The mask of civility cracked and fell away. Julian Croft took a half-step closer, his voice dropping to a low, confidential murmur that was far more terrifying than a shout. "It's a very isolated place out here, Mrs. Vance," he said, his smooth voice now laced with steel. His eyes flickered meaningfully towards Leo and Mia, who were watching, pale and silent. A jolt of pure animal terror shot through Ilara, so cold and sharp, it felt like a shard of ice being driven into her heart. "Dangerous," he continued, his gaze returning to her. "Snakes. Exposure. The structural integrity of that house is a death trap. A single mother with 2 small children. Things can happen out here." He let the words hang in the air, each one a poisoned dart. "Unfortunate accidents." The phrase was delivered with no emotion at all, a simple statement of fact. It was a death threat, delivered with the casual indifference of a man swatting a fly. Her blood ran cold. The fear for herself was nothing compared to the roaring, protective terror she felt for her children. He held her gaze for one more chilling moment, a silent promise of violence in his cold blue eyes. He had delivered his message. She had the proof, but he had the power, and he was not afraid to use it. "It would be a tragedy," he said, his voice once again smooth, "to become too attached to something that doesn't really belong to you. Think about my offer." He gave a curt, dismissive nod, as if concluding a business meeting. Then he turned, his back to her, and walked with the same unhurried, confident stride back to his car. The door closed with a solid, expensive thud. The engine purred back to life, and the sleek black car executed a perfect 3-point turn on the narrow track. It accelerated away, leaving her standing alone in a suffocating cloud of red dust and the lingering, metallic taste of fear. She was left shaking, clutching the proof of a $1 trillion crime and a direct, undeniable threat on the lives of her children. The dust slowly settled, revealing the empty, desolate landscape once more. The silence that rushed back in was heavier now, filled with menace. Ilara stood frozen, her mind screaming. The diamonds in the sack were no longer a symbol of salvation. They were a death warrant. The diary was not just a story. It was her own potential epitaph. Croft's offer was not a lowball negotiation. It was a choice. Her life for her silence. Her children's safety in exchange for letting a monstrous crime stand. The weight of the decision was crushing, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. For 40 years, this secret had been buried, protected by a man who sacrificed his name for it. Now, it was her burden. It was her fight. But looking at the small, terrified faces of Leo and Mia, she felt a wave of paralyzing fear. What would you do in her place? Would you fight for a justice that could get you and your children killed, or would you take the blood money and run? The terror Croft left behind was a physical thing, a toxic residue that clung to the air long after the dust from his car had settled. Ilara stood frozen, the diary clutched to her chest like a shield, her knuckles white and aching. The sun beat down, but she felt a profound internal cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The world had gone silent again, but it was a different silence now, a predatory stillness. Every rustle of the wind in the desiccated bushes sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe like a living threat. Her mind was a high-pitched scream, a feedback loop of his final words. Unfortunate accidents. The threat hadn't just been aimed at her. It had been a gilded arrow aimed directly at the hearts of her children, who now huddled behind her, their small hands gripping the back of her jeans. The vast, empty landscape, which had once felt merely indifferent, now felt actively hostile, an accomplice to the violence that had been promised. The weight of the secret, the diamonds, the diary, it was all secondary to the primal, animalistic fear for her young. She had to move. She had to run. But where? She was trapped in a cage of her own making, with the predator circling just outside the bars, waiting patiently. Her gaze swept the horizon, a desperate, frantic search for an escape that didn't exist. To the east was the single track leading back to a world where men like Croft held all the cards, where a sleek black car could appear and disappear, leaving death threats in its wake. To the west, nothing but an endless expanse of cracked clay and skeletal shrubs, a wasteland that promised its own slow, agonizing death. Then her eyes snagged on a distant shimmer, almost lost in the heat haze. It was a glint of sun on metal, a corrugated tin roof miles away, belonging to the only other sign of human life she had seen since arriving, the neighboring farm. It was another dilapidated homestead, another pocket of lonely existence in this forgotten corner of the world. The thought of approaching it sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Who lived there? Another pawn of Croft's, a resentful hermit who would shoot at trespassers. But what choice did she have? To stay here was to be a sitting duck, waiting for the hunter to return. To flee back towards the highway was to run into the spider's web. That distant, shimmering roof was the only unknown quantity, the only variable in an equation that otherwise added up to certain doom. It was a terrifying, desperate gamble, but it was the only one she had left to play. "Leo, Mia, hold my hands, tightly." Ilara's voice was a low, urgent whisper, stripped of all warmth and replaced with a grim, steely resolve. She knelt, forcing her trembling hands to be steady as she shoved the precious diary and the tin box deep into the canvas sack with the diamonds. The combined weight was immense, a physical burden that mirrored the crushing responsibility she now carried. She slung the heavy sack over her shoulder, the rough canvas chafing her skin, the angular shapes of the raw diamonds digging into her back. The pain was grounding, a sharp reminder of what was at stake. She looked at her children, their faces pale and streaked with dust, their eyes wide with a confusion and fear that broke her heart. There was no time to explain. There were no words to soften the terror of their situation. "We're going for a walk," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "We have to stay very quiet, like a game." Leo, ever perceptive, just nodded grimly, his small hand gripping hers with a strength that betrayed his fear. Mia whimpered, burying her face in Ilara's leg. Ilara pulled her close, her heart aching. Then, with one last terrified glance at the empty track where Croft had been, she turned her back on the ruin and began the long walk toward the shimmering roof on the horizon. The journey across the barren expanse was a waking nightmare. The midday sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on them with a physical force. There was no shade, no respite. The ground was a treacherous mosaic of deep, sun-baked cracks and loose-in sharp-edged rocks that threatened to turn an ankle with every step. The heavy sack dug relentlessly into Ilara's shoulder, throwing her off balance. Her muscles screamed with every agonizing footfall. She could feel the raw flesh of her hand where the rope had burned it, now chafed and dusty. The air was thick with heat, and with every ragged breath she inhaled fine, gritty dust that coated her throat and lungs. Her children struggled to keep up, their small legs unaccustomed to such a punishing trek. Mia began to cry after only a few hundred yards, her sobs small, breathless gasps of misery. Leo, though silent, stumbled frequently, his face flushed a dangerous shade of red. Ilara had to stop every few minutes, rationing the last of their warm, plastic-tasting water, her own thirst a raging fire in her throat. She felt her resolve begin to fray, the sheer physical misery compounding the terror in her heart. The distant roof seemed to recede with every step they took, a cruel mirage of salvation in a sun-drenched hell. It took them over an hour to cross the 2 miles of dead land that separated the properties, an hour that stretched into an eternity of heat, dust and fear. As they drew closer, Ilara saw that the neighboring farm was just as poor as her own, but in a different way. While Arthur's homestead was a ruin of sudden abandonment, this one was a testament to slow, stubborn decay. The farmhouse was a patchwork of mismatched boards and tar paper, its paint long gone. The barn sagged but still stood, its roof patched with rusted sheets of tin. A few scrawny chickens pecked listlessly in the dirt of a fenced-in yard. There was a sense of life here, however meager, a sense of someone clinging on, refusing to let go. But this did not comfort her. It only made her more anxious. A person who had survived this long out here would be tough, suspicious, and likely hostile to strangers. She hesitated at the edge of the property line, marked by a crumbling fence of stone and wire. The sack of diamonds felt like a lead weight, a beacon that screamed her secret to the world. She felt naked and exposed, a refugee begging for sanctuary at a fortress gate, with no idea if the man inside would offer her a cup of water or a shotgun blast. The silence from the farm was unnerving. She felt as if she were being watched from the dark windows. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did little to calm her racing heart, Ilara pushed open a rickety gate that groaned in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Hello," she called out, her voice thin and reedy, swallowed by the vast, empty air. "Or is anyone home?" There was no answer, only the low whistle of the wind moving through a crack in the barn wall and the distant, frantic buzzing of flies. She took a few tentative steps into the yard, her children clinging to her legs like frightened monkeys. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the person who lived in this desolate place. A battered, ancient pickup truck, its tires flat and its body a collage of rust and faded blue paint, sat near the barn, looking as if it hadn't moved in a decade. A line of faded denim work shirts hung stiffly on a clothesline, bleached nearly white by the relentless sun. Everything spoke of a life pared down to its barest essentials, a life of profound and solitary hardship. The feeling of being watched intensified, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she was not alone. The silence was not empty, it was waiting, it was judging. Her hand tightened on Leo's, her knuckles turning white. Suddenly, the front door of the farmhouse creaked open. The figure that emerged seemed to be carved from the landscape itself, as weathered and unyielding as the ancient, thorny shrubs that dotted the land. He was an old man, impossibly thin, with a cascade of white hair and a beard that fell to his chest. His skin was the color of tanned leather, a roadmap of deep wrinkles etched by decades of sun and hardship. He wore a faded flannel shirt, its sleeves rolled up to reveal sinewy forearms crisscrossed with pale scars. He held a heavy wooden walking stick in one hand, gripping it not like a support sun but like a weapon. But it was his eyes that stopped Ilara's breath in her throat. They were a pale, piercing blue, the same color as the merciless sky, and they were narrowed with a suspicion so profound it was almost a physical force. He didn't speak. He just stood on the sagging porch, watching her, his gaze missing nothing. Her ragged state, her terrified children, and the heavy, conspicuous sack slung over her shoulder. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ilara felt pinned by his stare, like an insect under a microscope. This was a man who had been alone for a very long time. A man who had learned that strangers brought nothing but trouble. Ilara's throat was so dry she could barely speak. She swallowed, the sound loud in her own ears. I'm Ilara Vance," she stammered, the name feeling both like a plea and an explanation. "Arthur Vance's great niece. I inherited the farm next door." At the mention of Arthur's name, she saw a flicker of something in the old man's piercing eyes, a change so subtle she almost missed it. The hard wall of suspicion didn't crumble, but a crack appeared in it. He shifted his weight, and the porch groaned beneath him. His gaze dropped from her face to the diary, which was just visible, peeking from the top of the canvas sack. He hadn't moved from the doorway, hadn't offered a single word of welcome or dismissal. He was a gatekeeper, and she had not yet spoken the password. The weight of the sack on her shoulder was unbearable, a constant, painful reminder of the danger she was in. The fear was a coiling snake in her belly, but desperation gave her a sliver of courage. She knew she had only one chance to win his trust, to prove she was not a threat, but a fellow victim of the same long shadow that had darkened this entire valley. She had to show him the truth. With a clumsy, trembling movement, Ilara lowered the heavy sack to the ground. The diamonds inside made a soft, clinking thud as the bag settled in the dust. Her children flinched at the sound, her hands shaking. She reached into the sack and pulled out the leather-bound diary. She held it out to him, a fragile offering across the chasm of fear and suspicion that separated them. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I found his diary." The old man's eyes locked onto the book. He stared at it, as if he were seeing a ghost. For a long moment, he remained perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of weathered stone. The wind picked up, kicking dust into little eddies around their feet. The silence was absolute. Ilara's arm began to ache from holding the book out, but she didn't lower it. Everything depended on this moment. She watched his face, searching for any sign, any hint of recognition or empathy. It felt as if the entire history of this place, the decades of secrets and lies, were all converging on this single, tense standoff in a dusty, forgotten yard under the blistering sun. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a prayer. "Please," she thought, "please help us." Slowly, as if moving against a great current, the old man descended the 3 rickety steps of his porch. His boots made no sound on the hard-packed earth. He walked towards her, his eyes never leaving the diary in her outstretched hand. He stopped just in front of her, so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of sun-dried cotton and dust that clung to him. He was taller than he had appeared on the porch, his presence formidable despite his age. With a hand that was gnarled and calloused, a hand that had clearly known a lifetime of hard labor, he reached out and took the book. His fingers brushed against hers, and his skin was as rough as sandstone. He didn't open it, he just held it, his thumb stroking the worn leather cover with a strange reverence, a familiarity that sent a jolt through Ilara. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, a sound of profound, ancient grief. The stony mask on his face finally crumbled, revealing a deep, aching sadness in his pale eyes. "Arthur," he breathed, the name a whisper of smoke on the dry air. "I knew it. I always knew you left it somewhere safe." He looked up from the book, and for the first time, his eyes met hers not with suspicion, but with a shared, terrible understanding. "My name is Silas," he said, his voice rough, like stones grinding together. "Get your children inside, now, before he comes back." The inside of Silas's farmhouse was a stark contrast to Arthur's ruin. It was dark, cool, and smelled of wood smoke, old books, and brewing coffee. Though Spartan and cluttered, it was meticulously clean. Every surface was wiped free of dust, every tool in its place. It was the home of a man who fought a daily, disciplined battle against the encroaching chaos of the wasteland outside. He led them to a small, sturdy wooden table in the kitchen, his movements economical and precise. "Sit," he commanded, his voice gruff but no longer menacing. He poured 3 glasses of water from a clay pitcher, the water shockingly cold and clean. Ilara watched Mia drain her glass in 3 long gulps, a painful lump forming in her throat. The simple act of kindness, of providing a cold drink to a thirsty child, felt so monumental it almost brought her to tears. Silas moved around the small kitchen with a quiet efficiency, his presence filling the space. He wasn't just an old recluse. There was an air of profound competence about him, a deep-seated capability that was both reassuring and intimidating. He was a survivor, in the truest sense of the word. He was the land's oldest living memory. Silas placed a steaming mug of black coffee in front of Ilara, the rich, bitter aroma a welcome shock to her system. He sat down opposite her, the heavy leather diary resting on the table between them like a sacred text. He had not opened it yet. He didn't need to. He ran a gnarled finger over the cover, his gaze distant, lost in a past only he could see. "I worked for Arthur when I was just a boy. Not much older than your own," he began, his voice a low rumble. "He wasn't my boss. He was my friend. The only one I ever had out here." He paused, taking a slow sip of his own coffee. "He taught me about the stars, about the rocks, taught me how to read. Said a man with knowledge could never be truly poor." The words were a quiet rebuke to the family folklore, to the image of Arthur as a failed eccentric. Ilara listened, captivated, feeling the gaps in her great-uncle's story being filled in, his ghost becoming more solid, more real. This wasn't just an ally, this was a witness, a guardian of a history that had been deliberately and cruelly erased. A cold dread mixed with a fragile sense of hope settled in her chest. The family stories, they said he was a failure, Ilara whispered, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. They said he lost his mind, that he wasted everything on this worthless land. Silas let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. It was the sound of old iron scraping against stone. "Worthless!" he scoffed, his eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce anger. "That's the lie they built their empire on. Arthur wasn't a failure. He was the smartest man I ever knew, and the bravest." He leaned forward, his pale eyes boring into hers, demanding that she understand the weight of his next words. "He found the diamonds almost 50 years ago. He came to me right here in this kitchen. His face was white as a sheet. He wasn't excited, girl. He was terrified. He said it wasn't a discovery. It was a death sentence. He knew what kind of men he was working for." The casual, matter-of-fact way Silas spoke of the diamonds, of this earth-shattering secret, sent a fresh shiver of fear down Ilara's spine. He had known. He had known all along. And he had kept the secret buried for half a century, waiting. Ilara's mind reeled. "You knew? All this time? You knew the land was valuable?" Silas nodded slowly, his gaze heavy with the burden of his long vigil. "Arthur made me promise. He knew they'd be watching the property. He knew they couldn't make their move as long as a Vance was on it. He made me swear I'd watch over the place after he was gone, make sure no squatters or prospectors came sniffing around. I was to wait for his family, for someone with his blood in their veins, someone who could finish what he started." He looked at Ilara, his expression a mixture of profound relief and weary resignation. "I've been waiting for you for a very long time, girl." The revelation was staggering. This quiet, reclusive old man was not just a neighbor. He was a sentinel, a lone soldier standing guard over a secret for decades, his life dedicated to a promise made to a dead friend. The sheer loyalty, the patient endurance of it, was awe-inspiring. Ilara felt a wave of profound gratitude wash over her, a feeling so potent it momentarily eclipsed her fear. She was no longer alone in this fight. She had an ally who had been preparing for this war his entire life. "A man came to see me today," Ilara said, her voice shaking as she recalled the sleek black car and the cold, predatory eyes. "He called himself Julian Croft." At the name, Silas's face darkened, the lines around his eyes deepening. The air in the small kitchen grew heavy, charged with a sudden, violent energy. Silas slammed his coffee mug down on the table, the ceramic cracking with a sharp report. Black coffee splashed across the wood. "Croft," he spat the name like a curse. "The son, just as rotten as the father, I'd wager." He stood up and began to pace the small space, his movements agitated, like a caged animal. "Oh, I saw the father, you know, old man Croft. Right after Arthur found the diamonds and started playing the part of the fool, Croft came out here himself. Didn't drive a fancy car back then, just a big dusty Buick. But he had the same devil's eyes his son has now." The memory was clearly a raw, vivid wound, even after all these years. Silas had not just heard the story, he had seen the villain's face. He was the last living link to the original crime. Silas stopped his pacing and turned to face her, his eyes burning with the memory. "I was mending a fence line. Up on the ridge that separates our properties, they didn't see me. Croft was screaming at Arthur, his face purple with rage. He was trying to get Arthur to sign a paper, shoving it in his face. A sales contract. I couldn't hear all the words, just bits. Pennies on the dollar, and nobody will ever know. Accidents happen." He repeated the phrase that Julian Croft had used on her, and the words echoed across the decades. A chilling legacy of violence and greed passed from father to son. Arthur just stood there and laughed in his face. A quiet, sad kind of laugh. He told Croft the land was worthless and that he'd die here before he sold his family's dirt. That's when I knew. Arthur wasn't just hiding the diamonds. He was using himself as a shield. He made himself the lock on the vault. The image was so powerful, so heartbreakingly heroic, that Ilara finally understood the true depth of her great-uncle's sacrifice. He hadn't just died to protect the secret, he had lived to protect it, enduring poverty and ridicule as a deliberate act of defiance. "So Croft's son is here now," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, grim tone. "That means they're done waiting. Your arrival, claiming the land, has forced their hand. They can't let it sit empty anymore, and they can't risk you finding what you've already found." He gestured towards the sack on the floor. "That offer he made you, the 10,000, that was a test. And your refusal was his answer. He knows you have the proof." A cold, hard certainty settled in Ilara's stomach. Silas was right. The game had changed. The long, quiet, cold war that Arthur had waged was over. Croft's visit wasn't a negotiation. It was the opening move of the final, violent endgame. "He threatened my children," she whispered, the words coming out in a choked sob. Silas's face hardened. The weary sadness in his eyes was replaced by a glint of pure and cold steel. "I know," he said softly. "That's how they operate. They find your weakness and they press on it until it breaks. But they've made a mistake. They think you're alone. They don't know about me." He walked to a corner of the room and picked up an old battered rifle that was leaning against the wall, its wood stock dark and smooth from years of use. "We can't go to the local sheriff," Silas stated, his voice flat and absolute as he checked the rifle's mechanism with practiced yet efficient movements. "Sheriff Brody's father was on the first Croft's payroll, and Brody's no different. He's been the one keeping tabs on this property for them all these years, reporting back to Titan Minerals." The revelation was another blow, another layer of the conspiracy that seemed to extend its tendrils into every corner of their world. They were not just isolated. They were surrounded, living on an island of truth in a sea of corruption. The law, the one institution she might have turned to, was just another weapon in the enemy's arsenal. The feeling of utter helplessness threatened to overwhelm her again. "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He'll come back. He won't just let us walk away with this." Silas looked up from the rifle, his pale eyes meeting hers. "No," he agreed, his voice grim. "He won't. He's not going to risk a public fight. He's not going to send lawyers. He's going to send thugs. Tonight, he'll want the diary, the maps, and the diamonds. And he'll want to make sure there are no witnesses left to tell the tale." The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The stunning beauty of the desert sunset was a cruel joke, a beautiful backdrop for the terror that was about to unfold. The encroaching darkness no longer felt like a blanket. It felt like a shroud. Silas moved with a quiet, purposeful urgency, closing the thick wooden shutters over the windows and barring the front door with a heavy iron beam. The small house was plunged into a dim, claustrophobic twilight, lit only by a single kerosene lamp on the table that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air grew thick with anticipation. Ilara could hear her own heart beating a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She looked at Leo and Mia, who had fallen into an exhausted, uneasy sleep on a small cot in the corner, their faces still and pale in the flickering lamplight. A wave of love so fierce it was agonizing washed over her. She would do anything, face any horror, to protect them. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a diamond-hard layer of maternal resolve. She would not let Croft win. She would not let Arthur's sacrifice be for nothing. Silas placed the rifle on the table next to the diary. Arthur wasn't just a geologist, he said, his voice low in the quiet room. He was a clever man. He knew this day might come. His house, it's not just a ruin. It has secrets of its own. He looked at Ilara, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. He showed me years ago. A way out, that isn't the door. The words hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope in the suffocating darkness. A hidden exit, a back door to the trap. Ilara's mind raced, trying to picture the ruined farmhouse, its collapsed roof and rotting floors. Where could a secret exit possibly be? It seemed impossible, another folk tale. But she trusted this man. She trusted his loyalty to her great-uncle. Silas seemed to read her thoughts. Croft's men will come through the front. They'll be loud and brutal. They'll expect you to be cowering in a corner. They won't be looking for a quiet escape. He then outlined the plan, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the swirling sea of her fear. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, a race against time and violence, but it was a plan, and a plan was infinitely better than simply waiting to die. The hours crawled by, each tick of an old clock on the mantelpiece, a hammer blow against the anvil of Ilara's nerves. The desert night fell completely, a profound, starless blackness that seemed to press against the shuttered windows. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind, the soft breathing of her sleeping children, and the frantic drumming of her own heart. She sat at the table, the heavy canvas sack at her feet, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were bloodless. She felt suspended in time, trapped in the suffocating silence before a storm. The fear was a living entity in the room, a cold presence that coiled in her stomach and constricted her throat. She replayed Croft's voice in her head, his smooth, venomous threats, and a fresh wave of terror and rage washed over her. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated Arthur. He had underestimated this quiet, resilient old man sitting across from her, his face illuminated by the flickering lamplight, his expression calm and resolute. They were not just a desperate woman and a forgotten old man. They were the keepers of the truth, and tonight they would either escape with it or be buried with it. It started not with a shout, but with a sound, a low, distant rumble that grew steadily louder, vibrating through the hard-packed earth and up through the floorboards of the house. It was the sound of a powerful engine, moving fast. Ilara's head snapped up, her eyes meeting Silas's across the table. He gave a single, slow nod. "They're here," he said, his voice devoid of any surprise. The sound was coming from the direction of her property, not his. They weren't coming for him yet. They were going to the farmhouse, assuming she was still there, trapped and alone. The rumbling grew to a roar, and then it was punctuated by a tremendous, violent crash, the sickening sound of heavy metal smashing through a rickety wooden fence, followed by the splintering of old, dry timber. The noise was brutal, an announcement of intent. There was no subtlety now, no pretense. This was not a search. It was an assault. A wave of cold, nauseating fear washed over Ilara. They were tearing her world apart to find her, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that they would not stop until they did. Silas was already on his feet, his movements swift and silent. He grabbed the rifle from the table and slung it over his shoulder. "It's time," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Grab the bag. Don't make a sound." Ilara's limbs felt heavy and unresponsive, her mind struggling to escape the paralysis of terror. The sounds from the next farm over were terrifying. The roar of the truck engine, the crunch of heavy boots on gravel, a man's gruff shout echoing in the night. She could almost feel the vibrations of their violence through the soles of her shoes. Then she looked at her children, still sleeping. Their innocent faces a stark contrast to the brutality unfolding just a mile away. The sight broke the spell of her fear. A surge of pure adrenaline, a mother's fierce, protective instinct, flooded her system. She scooped up the heavy sack, its weight a familiar burden now, and hurried to the cot. "Leo, Mia, wake up," she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. "We have to go, now, it's part of the game." Their sleepy, confused faces looked up at her, and her heart broke for the terror she was about to put them through. Just as Silas had predicted, he didn't lead them to the front or back door. Instead, he walked to the large stone hearth that dominated one wall of the main room. He knelt down and prized a loose flagstone from the floor in front of it. Underneath was not a cellar, but a dark, narrow opening, a tunnel just large enough for a person to crawl through. A rush of cool, earthy-smelling air wafted up. "It leads to the storm cellar behind the barn," Silas explained in a hushed whisper. "My grandfather dug it during the Dust Bowl days. A bolt hole. Now, hurry, the children first." Leo, his eyes wide but his face set with a brave determination, crawled into the opening without hesitation. Ilara helped a whimpering Mia squeeze in after him. The darkness swallowed them. "I'll be right behind you," Ilara whispered, her voice trembling. She turned back to Silas, who was already replacing the flagstone. "What about you?" she asked, her heart sinking at the thought of leaving him behind. "I'll follow," he said, his face grim in the lamplight. "I have my own way out. Now go." Your farm is the distraction. That's your head start. Run for the ridge to the north. My truck is hidden in the old arroyo. Don't stop for anything." Crawling through the narrow, suffocating tunnel was terrifying. It was utterly black. The darkness so complete it felt like a physical pressure against her eyeballs. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet earth and stone. She could hear Mia's soft sobs ahead of her and the scraping sound of Leo pushing forward. The heavy sack, which she had to push in front of her, snagged on roots and rocks, its weight a constant, dragging anchor. Panic, sharp and claustrophobic, clawed at the edges of her mind. She forced it down, focusing on the sound of Silas's words. Run for the ridge. The tunnel felt endless, a suffocating journey through the bowels of the earth. Her knees and elbows were scraped raw on the rough-hewn floor. Then, just as she felt her resolve beginning to crumble, she saw it, a faint rectangle of less dark blackness ahead. The exit. With a final, desperate push, she emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air of the storm cellar, gasping for breath. She pulled her children close, their small bodies trembling violently. They were out. They were free. But the race had just begun. Outside the storm cellar, the night was alive with menacing sounds. The shouts of the men at Arthur's farm carried on the wind, clear and brutal. Ilara could see the powerful beams of their flashlights sweeping back and forth across the ruined house, cutting sharp, frantic gashes in the darkness. They were searching, tearing the place apart. She knew it was only a matter of time before they realized she wasn't there and started searching the surrounding area. The ridge Silas had spoken of was a dark, hulking silhouette against the star-dusted sky, a seemingly impossible distance away across a treacherous open plain. Fear threatened to root her to the spot, but the feel of Mia's small, cold hand in hers was a potent antidote. "This way," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We have to run." And they ran. A clumsy, stumbling flight into the darkness. Ilara half-carried, half-dragged Mia, while Leo did his best to keep up, his breath coming in ragged sobs. The thorny desert scrub tore at their clothes and skin, and the uneven ground was a minefield of loose rocks and animal burrows. The sounds of the men behind them seemed to get closer with every step. The beams of the flashlights suddenly swung away from the house, sweeping out across the dark expanse of the desert. One of the powerful white cones landed just 100 yards to their left, illuminating the barren ground in stark, ghostly detail. Ilara threw herself and the children to the ground, pulling them down behind a small, thorny bush. Her heart hammered against the hard earth, so loud she was sure the men could hear it. She held her breath, pressing Mia's face into her shoulder to stifle her frightened whimpers. The beam of light paused, then swept slowly past them, a predatory eye. It felt like an eternity. Ilara could smell the dust, the fear sweat on her own skin, the sharp herbal scent of the crushed bush. This was real. This was a hunt. They were the prey. The light moved on, continuing its slow, methodical sweep. Ilara waited until her lungs were bursting, then slowly raised her head. The coast was clear, for now. "Come on," she breathed, her voice a raw, desperate rasp. "We have to keep moving." They scrambled to their feet and plunged back into the darkness. The image of that sweeping light burned into her mind. They were halfway to the ridge when a new sound cut through the night, a sound that made Ilara's blood run cold. It was the roar of the pickup truck's engine, revving high and angry. The headlights flared to life, two brilliant white eyes that turned the desert floor into a flat, shadowless stage. The truck tore away from the farmhouse, bouncing violently over the rough terrain, heading directly towards them. They had been spotted. The slow, methodical search was over. The direct, brutal pursuit had begun. There was no more hiding. There was only running. A primal scream of terror rose in Ilara's throat, but she choked it back. She couldn't afford to panic. "Leo, run!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Run for the rocks!" She scooped Mia up into her arms, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder from the heavy sack, and ran with a strength born of pure animal terror. The truck was gaining on them, its engine a deafening roar, its headlights pinning them like terrified insects. The ground trembled beneath their feet. They were so close to the ridge, but so terrifyingly, impossibly far. The base of the ridge was a chaotic jumble of large boulders and steep, crumbling inclines. It was their only hope for cover, Ilara scrambled up the first incline, her worn shoes slipping on the loose gravel. She half threw, half pushed Leo up ahead of her, his small hands clawing for purchase. She could hear the truck skidding to a halt just behind them, the doors slamming open, men shouting curses into the night. The beams of their flashlights were back, dancing frantically over the rocks, hunting for them. Ilara shoved Mia into a narrow crevice between two giant boulders, then squeezed in after her, pulling Leo in behind them. They were hidden for a moment in a pocket of deep shadow. Her lungs burned. Her heart felt like it was going to explode. She pressed her face against the cold, rough stone, listening. The sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel getting closer. They went this way. A gruff voice yelled, frighteningly near. "Spread out! Find them! Croft wants the bag and he wants them gone." The words were a death sentence, cold and final. Peeking through a crack between the rocks, Ilara saw them. Two large, hulking figures, their shapes made monstrous by the backlighting from the truck. They carried heavy iron crowbars in their hands. They began to climb the rocks, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, methodically searching every crack and shadow. One of the beams swept over their hiding place, lingered for a heart-stopping second, and then moved on. They hadn't been seen, but the men were closing in, their grunts of effort and the scrape of their boots on stone getting nearer and nearer. Ilara knew they had only seconds. Then, from further up the ridge, a new sound. Two short, sharp whistles. It was Silas. He was signaling them. She looked up and saw his dark shape silhouetted against the sky, beckoning them. It was another 50 yards of treacherous climbing. It was suicide, but staying here was certain death. "Now," she whispered, her voice shaking. With Ilara clutching the bag of diamonds and the precious diary, they burst from their hiding place and scrambled up the dark, rocky slope, racing towards Silas's silhouette, the shouts of the men and the beams of their flashlights exploding in the darkness right behind them. Silas's truck was a relic, smelling of oil, dust, and old iron, but its engine was a steady, powerful roar that devoured the dark road. It was the sound of salvation. Ilara huddled in the passenger seat, the heavy canvas sack clutched in her lap, like a newborn child. The adrenaline that had fueled her desperate flight from the rocks was rapidly draining away, leaving behind a profound, trembling exhaustion that seeped into her bones. Outside the window, the hostile desert landscape blurred into an undifferentiated darkness. She could still hear the men's shouts, still see the terrifying sweep of their flashlights in her mind's eye. Every bump in the road was a jolt of residual terror. She looked over at Silas, his gnarled hands steady on the steering wheel, his profile grimly illuminated by the faint green glow of the dashboard. "We're not going to the local police," he said, his voice a low rumble over the engine's noise. "They're his. We're going to the capital all night. It's the only way." The words hung in the air. This wasn't over. The escape from the farm was just the first step in a much larger, more dangerous war. The journey was a surreal passage through a sleeping world. The endless, star-dusted desolation of the wasteland slowly gave way to the dark, geometric shapes of irrigated farmland, then the scattered lights of small towns, each one a lonely outpost in the vast darkness. Ilara watched the world transform through the dusty windshield, feeling like a ghost haunting the edges of a life she no longer belonged to. In the cramped space behind the seats, Leo and Mia had finally succumbed to a deep, twitching sleep, their small bodies curled together for warmth. A fresh wave of love and agonizing guilt washed over her as she looked at them. They had survived, but she had exposed them to a horror no child should ever witness. The air began to change. The dry, earthy scent of the desert replaced by the faint, damp smell of civilization, of exhaust fumes and distant factories. As dawn approached, the horizon began to glow, not with the sun but with the hazy, orange luminescence of a major city. They were re-entering the world, not as citizens, but as fugitives carrying a truth as heavy and as dangerous as a bomb. Silas drove past the gleaming office towers and manicured lawns of the state capital, pulling up not to a police station, but to the stark, imposing facade of a federal justice building. Its grey, modernist architecture felt cold and impersonal, a monolith of power that made Ilara feel as small and insignificant as she had felt in Croft's shadow. It was early, the sun just beginning to cast long shadows across the empty plaza. Silas parked the truck, its rusty, battered frame an ugly scar against the pristine concrete. He got out and walked to a payphone on the corner, a relic from another era. Ilara watched him through the window as he fed coins into the slot and dialed, his back to her. His voice was too low to hear, but his posture was tense, urgent. She saw him gesture towards the truck, his words seemingly slicing through the morning quiet. He listened for a moment, then hung up. "He's sending someone down," Silas said, getting back in the truck, his face unreadable. "A federal prosecutor. Now we see if the law is worth more than Croft's money." The wait was agonizing. Each passing minute, a lifetime. A woman in a sharp, dark pantsuit emerged from the building's glass doors. She was tall, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, even from a distance, looked sharp and discerning. She scanned the plaza, her gaze landing on the dilapidated truck with a flicker of skepticism. This was Agent Miller, the prosecutor Silas had contacted. She approached them, her expression a careful mask of professionalism that did little to hide her doubt. Ilara felt a familiar sting of shame, acutely aware of their appearance, her torn, dusty clothes, Silas's weathered face, the terrified, exhausted pallor of her children. They looked like vagrants, not credible witnesses to a massive corporate crime. Miller led them through a silent, echoing lobby and into a sterile, quiet conference room on an upper floor. The room smelled of strong coffee and floor polish. "Silas, your contact said this was a matter of life and death," Miller began, her voice crisp and impatient. "I hope for your sake it is." Ilara, trembling, stepped forward and heaved the heavy canvas sack onto the polished table with a heavy, dusty thud. The thud of the bag echoed in the silent, unsterile room. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, with hands that shook so badly she could barely control them, Ilara pulled open the sack. The raw, uncut diamonds tumbled out, a cascade of dull, gritty stones that seemed to absorb the room's fluorescent light. Agent Miller stared, her professional composure momentarily cracking. Ilara then carefully removed the leather-bound diary and the rolled-up geological maps. "His name was Arthur Vance," Ilara said, her voice raw and hoarse. "This was his." She opened the diary to the first page, the elegant script, a silent testimony from the grave. Silas stepped forward, his voice a low, steady counterpoint to Ilara's trembling narrative, recounting his own memory of the elder Croft's threats, his words painting a vivid picture of decades of greed and intimidation. Agent Miller picked up one of the largest diamonds, its weight solid and surprising in her hand. She turned it over, then looked at the maps, her sharp eyes tracing the red-inked circle around the word Kimberlite. The skepticism vanished from her face, replaced by a look of cold, focused fury. The next 48 hours were a dizzying whirlwind. Agent Miller, now a whirlwind of decisive action, set the full, formidable weight of the federal government in motion. The conference room became a command center. Geologists were brought in under secrecy. They took one look at the maps and the diamond samples, and their eyes widened with disbelief and professional awe. Document experts authenticated Arthur's diary, its ink and paper consistent with the era. Ilara, in a clean, quiet room, gave her deposition, recounting every detail from the eviction notice to Julian Croft's chilling threats, her voice growing stronger and steadier with every word. Silas's testimony was the historical anchor, a living link to the conspiracy's origins. Ilara and her children were moved to a secure, undisclosed location, a comfortable suite in a downtown hotel with clean sheets, warm food, and guards at the door. It felt like another planet. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ilara slept a deep, dreamless sleep. The heavy weight of the secret finally lifted from her shoulders and placed into the capable, relentless hands of justice. The news broke like a thunderclap. Ilara watched it unfold on a large television in the safe house, her children playing quietly on the floor nearby. The screen showed live footage from a helicopter, circling the gleaming glass and steel headquarters of Titan Minerals. A fleet of black government vehicles had swarmed the entrance. Federal agents in tactical gear poured into the lobby. The camera zoomed in on the main doors. A moment later, Julian Croft emerged, surrounded by agents. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his impeccable suit was rumpled, and the mask of cool, patrician authority had been shattered, replaced by a look of stunned, venomous rage. It was the face of a king whose empire had just crumbled to dust. The image was a perfect, satisfying inversion of the powerful predator who had threatened her in the desert. The news anchor's voice was electric with the story. CEO of Titan Minerals arrested in a massive, decades-long fraud scheme potentially worth trillions. A tear, hot and cleansing, slid down Ilara's cheek. It was over. The ghost of Arthur Vance could finally rest. The downfall of Titan Minerals was as swift as it was spectacular. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of the diary, the maps, and Silas's testimony, the entire conspiracy unraveled in court. Decades of fraudulent land acquisitions were exposed, and the contracts were voided by federal judges. Julian Croft and his top executives were convicted on a raft of charges, from fraud and conspiracy to attempted murder, and were sentenced to long prison terms. But for Ilara, the most surreal moment came in a quiet lawyer's office. A man in an expensive suit explained, in calm, measured tones, the full legal ramifications. The court had not only affirmed her ownership of the 640-acre Dust Bowl property, but had also fully recognized her as the sole legal owner of its mineral rights. He slid a portfolio across the desk. It contained geological assessments and market valuations. The numbers had so many zeros they looked like a typo. It wasn't just millions. It was a fortune so vast it was almost meaningless. A level of wealth that would reshape not just her life, but the lives of her children's children for generations to come. 1 year later, the sun rises over a landscape transformed. The skeletal ruin of the farmhouse is gone, replaced by a beautiful, sprawling ranch house built from warm stone and cedar. Where the cracked red clay once stretched to the horizon, there is now a vast expanse of lush, green lawn, watered by a deep, newly drilled aquifer that has brought life back to the land. The only sound is the gentle creak of a swing set, and the delighted laughter of Leo and Mia as they soar towards the blue sky. Ilara stands on the wide, shaded porch, a warm ceramic mug of coffee in her hands. The smell is rich and invigorating. She is no longer the gaunt, haunted woman from the rusty car. Her face is full, her eyes clear and calm. She watches her children play, her heart filled not with the frantic, clawing fear of a cornered animal, but with a profound, quiet peace. The heavy canvas sack is gone, replaced by the simple, comforting weight of the coffee mug. She is no longer a fugitive or a victim. She is home, in a sanctuary built on the foundations of truth and courage. She is finally, completely safe. She looks out at the distant ridge where she and Silas had made their desperate stand, and a small smile touches her lips. The property is no longer called the Dust Bowl. On the new gate at the entrance, a simple, elegant sign reads Arthur's Rest. The immense wealth was a shocking, life-altering gift, but the true treasure was the redemption of her great-uncle's name, the restoration of his legacy from one of failure to one of quiet, enduring heroism. The diamonds had bought security, but the truth had bought her soul back. Her children's laughter is the testament to his sacrifice, a joyful sound that has finally silenced the ghosts of the past. It's a powerful reminder that even when buried under decades of lies and despair, the most valuable legacies are those of integrity and resilience, waiting for a spark of courage to bring them to light. If you were moved by Ilara's journey from desperation to redemption, and you believe in the power of stories where justice prevails against all odds, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss the incredible stories of triumph we have coming next.